And I want to note, like, tomorrow there's even another slot where I kind of talk about this, or if there's time today, we move it to today, but that talk is a little bit more on the line of the practical sort of issues, like what do you do besides fasting, and that's sort of the next talk. This one is, I would say a little bit, I'm not going to talk very long. I'm going to present some work that I've done myself and in collaboration with TCC, and give some sort of ideas, and actually it builds really well on the sorts of things that have been talked about earlier today. Like that. So I hear a common complaint, right, in general, why don't people use our conservation plans? And, you know, if you want your plans to be used in general, you have to align them with the goals of whatever communities that you want to work with or societies. And I want to spin something positive here. I think they can be. I think they can be way more effectively accomplished, not just through face-to-face communication, which I will talk about, and face-to-face is super important, but also taking and seizing some opportunities where you see those alignments, and where you can really foster collaboration. So I want to talk a little bit about that, and just to remind you of where I'm coming from with this, from thinking about the history of the sciences and thinking about the culture of science, is that we have to, you know, resist the urge to bring the facts to the communities, because it just doesn't seem to work that way. In terms of what the literature shows, what the empirical data shows from the sciences. Richard Howitt, a geographer working mostly in Australia, has said the myth of objective and neutral resource management needs to be abandoned to instead develop a field of environmental management that measures success in terms of social justice, ecological sustainability, economic equity, and cultural diversity, something that's absolutely echoed in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment as well. And I might add, you know, flexibility. We need to measure flexibility, perhaps, in thinking about doing resource management differently. And again, reminding you of the figure that I introduced of how to think about this world of communication. And community goals and values, as we all are embedded in our changing ecosystems and environments, has lots of implications on how both managers and scientists and landscape planners develop research questions. And we have to recognize that there's a particular history that we've all been a part of, the things that influence each of us to do the jobs that we do today. For me, yesterday, if you remember, I grew up in the age of Greenpeace's big push to stop the killing of baby seals, right? And that's what propelled me to start to think about environmental management. And remember, I'm from an urbanized area, urbanized New Jersey. And when I started working with Orville Huntington back in like 2003, 2004, you took me on my first moose hunt. And as a Jersey girl, I was sort of horrified at first, but this is so violent, this killing of the moose, right? And I learned, and I remember your response, and you're like, gosh, you know, television is way more violent than what we're doing, right? You know? And he's like, I don't want my daughters to watch A&E and Law and Order. That's so violent, right? And so what that gets at is this urban-rural divide, very much, which we often see in the gun debate as well, right? If you're thinking about politics, right? So, you know, I want to argue here that meaningful engagements are about forming research agendas and co-producing data with communities, right? And there is a lot of literature that talks about what co-production is, and I don't want to bore you with those kinds of theories, but I want to, you know, say that research and management should help maximize flexibility at the local scale to cope with some transformation, right? And again, it's about choice. People want to choose what their economies are. People want to choose what their own identities are. People want to choose their own future. And if management and research can work to help people make those choices, that is a better collaboration to have, right? And the first thing, right, a lesson from some of what I talked about yesterday, is to recognize community, not just individuals, not, a gross notion of humans as individual actors, right? And you can utilize a lot of different social science techniques to understand those things, and I'll talk about a couple of them in a second. And again, avoid reducing human motivation to greedy actors, which quite frankly are urban cultures, right? Not necessarily some of the other cultures that are really prevalent in this particular region. And understand that the goals of these communities are to often keep things the same, not to try and push to a totally new state, right? And it's meaning the sustainability of their resource or resource availability, and the sustainability of their own identity. And so it's important to see the role of local and informal institutions in enforcement and management, and to support those local informal and formal institutions through capacity building and trust. And that again builds on the work of Elinor Ostrom, right, who got the Nobel Prize in Economics by articulating that there are these sort of non-formal institutions that set up rules at a very local scale to determine access and things like that. And what we maybe want to do as managers and researchers is to identify some of those things and build capacity in locally for that to happen. And also, coming from yesterday, to recognize local knowledges and how people have very intimate experience with ecosystems at very small scale, and that these knowledges are directly tied to what they do on the landscape. Again, not all humans are the same type of actors, and it's probably time to start articulating things like big boats versus small boats, local hunters versus non-local or urban hunters, because they are different ecological actors. Someone coming from Anchorage over to Hooslea does not know that local ecology by comparison to the people of that region, and therefore they might behave differently and make different choices on that landscape. And that we can talk to people and map these spatial relationships, right? I showed you the maps done in the New England fisheries, but I want to show you a map that I and TCC has done pretty recently. This is research funded by the National Park Service, and this is actually the first time I'm showing some of this outside of the tribe. And we worked with the Alpaca and Latina tribe, and what this map shows, last year about this time of year, I went in, and I'll talk a little bit about that process, but we mapped where people went on the landscape and what is most important subsistence usage in that given area. And that's what they sort of showed us. One of the things that surprised me, I shouldn't have surprised me, but it did, is not that people went a lot along the river system, right? This is the Latina River here, the Kayakuk River here, but, and this is a community refuge right here, Community National Wildlife Refuge, but notice a lot of the places where they go has the most diversity, right? Has the most forest diversity. And we didn't show them a map of the forest and say where in the forest you go. We did it through oral interviews of people just telling us where they went, or marking on a map and circling particular areas just on a topographic map about where they went. And this is participatory GIS, right? This is a way to incorporate this local knowledge in terms of understanding how people are utilizing the landscape. This might be the older set of slides. So in thinking about this particular project, it started with, I think, the National Park Service was looking for a partner to do this work. What they wanted to do, the purpose of it was, number one, to develop better relationships with the tribes, was actually a directive of this project. Number two is to really understand how people utilize the landscape. Just right up in here is Gates of the Arctic National Preserve, right below the Gates of the Arctic National Park there. And on the side, certainly not in the contract that explained the purpose, which was to understand moose climate change, basically. But I was told by the office as well that they wanted to document this in part because of the proposed road coming across this way into the Ambler mining field. Right? There is this Roads to Resources agenda for the state of Alaska, and this is probably, a lot of people are suggesting it's going to happen. And in fact, this is Wednesday, yes? Today, there's a whole bunch of people from Department of Transportation descending on Alakaka to talk about this issue in particular. Now, my understanding is that Park Service went to TCC and said, do you know anyone that we could work with? And Orville, I believe, said, why don't we do it? And then he called me up and said, would you like to partner with us to complete this work? And I said, oh yeah, that would be just so awesome, right? So we developed a way to work with these tribes. And of course it involved an initial visit back, not this past June, but the June before, to align the goals, right? And I said, the Park Service wants to document where you go. And also, the Native leadership there says, well, will that be useful with this road coming through? And I said, it could very well be, because you could start to show perhaps impact to what this road might do to the way you live. And there was a lot of concern. There's always concern, will people tell you stuff? But all of a sudden, when I said, well, this is a pathway for you to communicate to the world what this impact of a road could be on the landscape and on your lifeways, people just started telling me everything, right? And it's about aligning the goals. My goals didn't change, right? As a researcher, my goals did not change, right? But it's about identifying what you could do with the information that really can excite people to be involved, right? Don't just say, I'm going to collect the data, but say, what are we going to do with this information that could be of immediate use to you and your community's goals? So that I think was number one. And so that was the first trip, right? I didn't do any data collection. And then I went back during the hunting season. We designed the project, and I'll talk a little bit about the budget tomorrow or at the next talk. The budget was designed to filter lots of the money into the community in all sorts of ways. So I paid for gas to go all the way up the Alatna River and document some important places along the river for subsistence, for salmon reproduction, for example. I mean, I think up the Alatna River, one of these rivers is where a whole lot of salmon spawn. And it's whitefish. Whitefish is super important in the Alatna River. And so I did a trip there and spent time there in the fall time. And then I went back around this time, early December, to do the interview stage to document this stuff. Where do you go? And again, it was timed in such a way where people weren't busy on the landscape. It was cold, it was dark, and actually last year this time there was still no snow on the landscape. So it was actually a perfect opportunity to get, and I pretty much got 98% household participation in this whole thing, right? I got probably 100% in Alatna and about 98% in Alakakit household participation in the surveys. So I have a lot of confidence in what this shape is and what it does. And you can certainly see great connections all the way to Huslia as far as where people go on the landscape. And so that was super important in terms of understanding and working with these tribes. Then we went back, Orville and I went back to present the visual data and to communicate orally and in a summary document what I found from the other parts of the interviews and such. And in that phase was really interesting too, right? Because again, everybody around the table, and it was a big room. Everybody was packed into the tribal office to look at some of this stuff. And it wasn't just the maps, right, from the data collection, but I talked with Mike Spindler before even starting this project, and he had suggested an idea of digitizing the place name atlas, having to do with this exact area. And so I could incorporate that project into it to better create these stronger ties between community and the tribe, and TCC and the tribes, and so on. You can align goals, and you can align goals effectively to benefit everybody. So we made a website, we made a series of maps, and we made a couple of videos that at this last time we visited the tribe in the summertime to get feedback on these products, right? And they gave me some suggestions about the mapping part of it. One of the things that we had done at first with the map, we ended up with just these dots, sort of strong dots on the landscape. And I said, I know you don't helicopter in, but it's emphasizing places of important usage. And they're like, no, we really have to connect those dots, because if we see a moose from between here and there, that doesn't mean we're not going to shoot it, right? And so we had to alter the map based on the feedback of the community. And that process is important, right? And when I go and I'm, after this meeting, I'm finalizing this whole report, and we will be bringing it back or sending it back to the tribe for their final approval, right? And remind them of each phase of this procedure right now, which is about a year and a half long for this particular project. And it could be really interesting. I learned a lot this morning thinking about modeling and thinking about what these tribes, for example, would be entirely interested, I think, in some of the very scenario planning, especially in the face of development, because they specifically wanted me to ask questions in my interviews about what do you think the impact of the road is, so that everybody in the community could talk about that and contribute that. So I added it on my interview agenda. Okay, the tribes want to know that. I'm going to add that to my set of questions. And then I was able to tell them, everybody I talked to was against this road. Every single one of them. They had lots of pretty sophisticated understandings of both short-term and long-term possible benefits of the road through the region. But every single one of them, at the end of the day, said, but I don't want that for my community. And so this is one sort of opportunity to work with tribes that could have exactly the same goals as a lot of you in the room here do. It's an opportunity. And I like, the way Terry talked about ecological opportunities. There are social opportunities happening all the time, and you can take advantage of those. As managers, as researchers, all the time. So that's one example. And I think it's also super important to recognize that local knowledge is very different than traditional ecological knowledge, that they're not the same thing, that it's really a spiritual and ethical component. It's already managing resources. Again, Orville and I have published a paper together in which he talked about how wisdom is different than knowledge. Wisdom is knowledge packaged in an ethical way that tells us how to deal with the world, right? And that's what's important too. Traditional knowledge could guide some decision making in ways that we haven't tapped into at all quite yet as researchers. And recognize that, this care about environment is not just a care about environment, but again, it's about practices like don't shoot the lead caribou. Is there actual science that supports that? No, right? But if you decide to ignore that, it's problematic, right? And sometimes these things don't correspond to the scientific worldview, right? But ignoring them will reduce the trust and reduce the idea of partnership and actual collaboration. And so that's what another cautionary note that I would add. And there are growing citizen science approaches to data gathering, and certainly some of the co-management regimes and the Refuge and Information Technician Program of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service certainly are ways that tribal members have become incorporated into the practices of science as data gatherers, but there's probably a lot of other things that people could do on that landscape to be able to tell us things about what's going on in the world. Again, it's important to design and frame research questions that might talk about things other than global population, and to make it relevant at that local level. And you can do both. It's just that we haven't often done both. You can align those goals, is what I'm trying to say here. So, for example, in the White Planet East work I did, people said, well, why can't I use my instincts as a hunter and look for the birds? Well, why do I have to be in a boat? Why can't we go in the uplands where sometimes they do nest, right? Or why don't we take out elders more frequently on either molting surveys or whatever? Because if you think about it, right, elders used to be able to be at camp, right, wherever it is, all the time. These are the key knowledge holders and wisdom keepers in these communities. And because they're now not as mobile and in houses, in villages, they're not out on the landscape nearly as much as they used to be. We could encourage building adaptive capacity within the tribes to be able to communicate at the tribal level about what's going on in the landscape. These are folks that have those longer-term knowledges and understanding about the ecosystem that then can translate it to younger generations within the communities. So that's just a couple of ideas that I've generated. And again, I'm showing the ecological stuff. We in this region have a lot of resources to be able to contribute to these ideas. A lot of people at the village level can participate and probably want to participate as well. It's about incentivizing. It's about aligning the goals. It's also, and I'll talk a little bit about this in another talk, it's also about communicating who you are and what you want as a person and not your institution, right? And connecting with people on a one-to-one basis as well. We are each one of us motivated to do our jobs in particular ways. And it's essential to, maybe sit down at a poker table in mulatto, like I love to do. And I learned so much about fish sitting around the poker table in June and July that you wouldn't believe, right? And so there's lots of techniques and things that you can do that are pretty interesting, I find, that we haven't yet tapped into. So that's just one set of thoughts, right? And one very short set of suggestions that I have, indications. And as you continue to munch and whatever, I think it might be, I have a few discussion questions to sort of pose here that you can talk now amongst yourself more broadly and think maybe about efforts that the LCC has already done, and if what I've talked about has either inspired you, or if other people in the room have other sorts of things that they've experienced. I know Terry, for example, has done really interesting workshops in Huslia and probably other places. I only know the Huslia one, but I'm sure there's lots of folks in here that have other sorts of contributions to make on how to work with tribes. So I'll open it up.